All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, good evening. We have people, including the panelists themselves, joining us from all corners of the world. And we'll have, no doubt, a very interesting session on approaches to measuring development impact. We have 4 panelists today. One has just dropped off the screen, but I'm sure he'll join us back very soon. I will introduce them. They'll each make a 10 to 12 minute presentation. And I do encourage the members of the audience to post their questions and comments in the chat and in the Q&A. I will try and keep some time at the end for questions and discussion, or perhaps after each presentation, sort of allow them to answer one question quickly before we move on. So with that, let me introduce our first panelist today, Cyrus Sami. He's Associate Professor of Politics at New York University and Executive Director of the Evidence in Governance and Politics Network. Very nice to see a fellow political scientist. This conference has been largely populated by economists, so it is nice to expand to the other social sciences as well. Cyrus is a social science methodologist with expertise on randomized controlled trials for social interventions. Cyrus, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ramona, and thanks everybody for attending. I'm just going to share some slides here. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to talk to you about an initiative that the Evidence in Governance and Politics, also known as EGAP network, has undertaken over the past, almost 10 years or so. It's what we call the Metaketa initiative, and it's an approach to doing coordinated randomized control trials to evaluate intervention concepts. Our domain is governance intervention, so trying to improve accountability and political participation in a variety of contexts so as to evaluate generalizability. So I'll talk a little bit about EGAP as an organization, then I'll describe this Metaketa initiative, talk about the different rounds that we've done and some of the achievements. So first, a little bit about EGAP, the Evidence in Governance and Politics Network. Why you should be interested in us. We are a global network of experts, and we focus on testing innovations in governance. So that includes innovations in the domains of elections, in sort of institutional design, so bureaucracy, and addressing questions of like corruption and bureaucratic efficiency, governance related issues that affect poverty and inequality, and then also interventions that attempt to mitigate societal conflict. And what we do as a network essentially is to try to facilitate partnerships between researchers like myself and then practitioners from both governmental and non-governmental organizations to execute these studies and this sort of research and tests of governance innovations. And then we also do a lot of work to develop methodological standards and tools that are quite general that could be applied across various domains, not just in the world of governance. So we've undertaken something known as the Metaketa initiative. I should give some credit to FCDO/UCAID/DFID for their support in this. We've also had support from some private philanthropic donors. The term Metaketa is Basque for accumulation. And what it basically is a set of, it's an approach to doing coordinated randomized control trials of interventions across a variety of contexts. And EGAP as a network, and through the Metaketas in particular, emphasizes transparency and replication in the work that we do. Thus far, the initiative has included over 100 researchers working in 30 projects in 19 countries. And there's a map there of sites of the various studies and collaboration efforts that we've undertaken as part of the initiative so far. So why should you be interested in this initiative? We are responding to problems that we've recognized in the way that knowledge about interventions is produced. And so, we find that oftentimes research production is non-transparent. We find that there are too many one-off studies and one-off RCTs and people trying to generalize off of them. And then we find that there's too little collaboration and too little pooling of knowledge across studies as well. And so the Metaketa initiative was designed to address these problems. It is an intervention in itself, if you will, to address these problems in knowledge production. So we created the Metaketa initiative as a model that's focused on openness and transparency, collaboration, robustness, and generalizability. So we've had 5 rounds so far. So 4 are completed. The 5th is still underway. It was sort of delayed because of the COVID crisis, but is resuming work now. And they've focused on interventions, looking at strategies to improve voter information and therefore to improve accountability, to address taxation and formalization, to improve natural resource governance. Another one that was testing community policing as a strategy for improving trust between police and citizenry. And then the current round is looking at strategies to promote women's political participation. And each of the studies, it's kind of interesting, the results that they've generated illustrate different ways that you can learn from coordinated RCTs. So if we look at the first one was testing strategies used by civil society organizations to try and improve transparency in elections by creating sources and disseminating nonpartisan information about government and politician performance. And so the proposition is that access to this kind of information might improve voters' ability to hold leaders accountable, and in particular, to hold underperforming leaders accountable. And the result from this was just a string of null results, actually. And that's what the graph on the right shows you. And so in this kind of case, one of the things that the Metaketa did was by basically replicating a null like this across multiple contexts, it sort of like takes the conversation into the direction of really challenging some of the assumptions behind these interventions. Whereas a one-off study that generates a null result might lead people to say, well, what was going on there doesn't necessarily apply to us. The way that the intervention was implemented was bad, or the research wasn't done well. When you have it done across a variety of contexts and working with a variety of partners, all of whom were using compelling interventions, we would say, and you get this repeated finding, I think it does more to sort of push the question in the direction of what's going on with the theory of change here. Is there something that we're missing out on? And there's been subsequent work to try and unpack that. That's been fruitful. But I think having the replications here, immediate replications, this is like the sort of value of this, is that you get an immediate string of replications. It really pushes, I think, people to rethink the theory of change in a way that a single study wouldn't accomplish. The next study was looking at basically strategies to try and bring more households and firms inside the social contract with government. So the idea was to test interventions that would remove barriers to household or firm formalization, and then to evaluate the effects on tax compliance and access to government service. In this case, what we see is compelling heterogeneity across contexts. Okay, so in some places, when you look at whether this sort of subsidy or consulting that was offered to promote formalization had an impact in the sort of first stage outcome of formalization, you see a lot of variety across contexts. Each of these studies, by the way, in and of themselves, is very well powered. They are each very large scale RCTs. And you see some really interesting variation here. And so that led to some subsequent sort of exploratory mixed qualitative quantitative work to try and understand what some of the contextual variation might be that could help us to understand why these sorts of pushes in some places actually translate into formalization, whereas in other places they don't. And so if you look at the study that came out of it, it's a very interesting sort of cross-context, almost macro level discussion of the factors in which this sort of assistance can actually translate into formalization and can actually translate into increasing the extent to which households and firms enter into the social contract with government. Then the third study was a study of strategies to promote sustainable natural resource use, so in forests and water. And the intervention here was to basically work with NGOs and civil society organizations to sort of apply a combination of new technologies for monitoring and participatory strategies to get communities involved in sort of monitoring jointly at a community level natural resource use. So building on some theories of sustainable resource use from Elinor Ostrom and others, it was a way of kind of operationalizing some of these ideas, taking advantage of new technologies for sort of remote monitoring of resource use and testing them out in communities. And this is, I think this is an example that it's a great example of something that I think you see in the Campbell collaboration logo, where you have a collection of modest effects that are all sort of pointing in the same direction, but then when you compile all the results together, you get sort of a compelling, consistent result. So the graph on the right is the meta-analysis table, the forest plot, where you have effects that are all sort of moving in the same direction. Each individual study can only speak, sort of a noisy manner to this, but when you compile all the evidence together, you get, pretty compelling indication of a modestly beneficial effect across these interventions. So even though each study was fairly large scale, the magnitude of the effects were fairly small, and so you really need to aggregate across them. Those are just some examples, and so the other two Metaketas also contain examples that combine some of the various things I've talked about in these other Metaketa rounds already. What the studies allow us to do then is to bring compelling evidence to policymakers, and we have some examples of that across the Metaketas. So we've actually found that policymakers like to have evidence from their own context, but then they also find it informative to learn across other contexts too. It gets them to think about macro level variation that might be important and sort of structural features of their own context in comparison to other contexts that might matter. So it's turned out to be a pretty compelling way to go to policymakers and get them to think about how to implement reforms or design reforms. So
1 minute, Cyrus.
Yep. So I'll just wrap up here. So I think what we've done is to show policymakers, practitioners, and researchers how you can give a big push to a research program by doing basically an immediate set of replications. I think we've been able to influence policymakers and researchers to think in terms of cross-context differences and similarities. I think the initiative has set standards for transparency and reproducibility. If you go onto the website for the Metaketas, you'll see all of the data and everything, all the pre-analysis plans available for people. And so now we're using this as the basis for some new initiatives, such as creating platforms and master protocols that allow for ongoing accumulation of evidence in research programs. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cyrus. Very, very interesting. Both to see how you've been able to use randomized control trials across areas as diverse as natural resource management, taxation, voting, and of course, across different countries. Perhaps in the discussion later on, you could come back to two very interesting points that you made. One is about how this has helped in some cases revisit assumptions and sort of push the conversation on the theory of change itself, because I think that's a critical element. And the other one was about a point that you mentioned very quickly about how policymakers like, of course, evidence from their own country, but are also receptible to evidence from other contexts, especially when it is compelling and perhaps presented in a compelling way. I think that would be interesting to unpack a little bit more. So I will leave those with you, and perhaps some of the other panelists will want to come in on those points as well. But for now, let me invite again members of the audience to post their questions and comments in the chat or the Q&A. And for now, let me turn to the second presenter, Hugh. Dr. Hugh Sharma Waddington specializes in policy research on topics like water, sanitation, and hygiene, the famous WASH, governance, and agriculture using methods like impact evaluations, systematic reviews, and meta-analysis. He set up 3IE's Systematic Reviews Program and the London office at the London International Development Centre. And he's also founding editor and a former co-chair of the Campbell Collaboration's International Development Coordinating Group. Hugh, over to you. You also have 10 to 12 minutes. You're muted. We can see your slides, but I still can't hear you. That unmute button at the bottom of the screen is not working. Very bizarre. And I cannot unmute you either. Do you want to remove the headset and see if that changes anything? No. The unmute button is at the bottom under the Windows. You know it. Yeah, you know it. Okay. There you go. No, still not working. Can't hear you. Do you want to leave and join again? I'll go to the next presentation. All right. Okay. Next up then is Jian-Guo Xu. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name, from Lanzhou University. And he will be presenting on using Mendelian randomization as the cornerstone for causal inference in epidemiology. He is a Master of Medicine, and his main research direction is the methodology of evidence synthesis and evaluation. He is also a member of the Evidence-Based Medicine Center of Lanzhou University, the World Health Organization Collaborating Center for Guideline Implementation and Knowledge Translation, and the Chinese Grade Center. Jian-Guo, you have the floor.
Okay.
Excellent. We can see your slides and we can hear you, so go ahead.
Okay. Thanks for the introduction of our chair, Prof. Ramona. My name is Jian-Guo Xu, and I come from the Evidence-Based Medicine Center of Lanzhou University. And it's also my honor to be able to participate in WWJS. And the topic I will share today is using Mendelian randomization as a cornerstone for causal inference in epidemiology. Next, I will make a brief summary of the basic principles of Mendelian randomization, analyze the current research status and frontiers in this field, and predict future research trends for scientific research. And we know inferring the causal relationship between related variables is a common problem in biology. In traditional observational epidemiological studies, causal conclusions are rarely proven to be reasonable. Observational epidemiological studies can never ensure that the association of all confounding factors have been identified, measured, and approximately adjusted. Even if there is an association between two variables, the direction of causality is not clear, which makes causal inferences subject to hinder. Genetic variation is determined at conception and will not change due to environmental factors. At the same time, genetic variation is inherited independently, which means that they are often specific in association. Mendelian randomization is a method used in epidemiology to explore causal inferences. Mendelian randomization takes genetic variants as exposure of interest in observational data, which is not influenced by traditional research design and is a form of instrument variable analysis. As Mendel's law of inheritance splits, alleles split randomly from parents to offspring. Therefore, the genotype of the offspring is unlikely to be related to confounding factors in the population. Mendelian randomization involves looking for genetic variants associated with exposure and then testing the association between these variants and the outcomes. When the necessary conditions are met, the causal relationship between exposure and outcome can be estimated. And we use the methods of bibliometric analysis to identify published related research of Mendelian randomization. The article was selected from the Web and Science Co-Collection database, and the EndNote, Excel, US View, and StatSpace were used to analyze the information. And in the analysis of the annual publication, we found the first included document appeared in 2003. Smith published the article entitled Mendelian Randomization: Can Genetic Epidemiology Contribute to Understanding Environmental Determinants of Disease, which formally proposes the concept of Mendelian randomization. And this is the first time that Mendelian randomization has been systematically introduced in academic literature. This review was also widely considered to be the first symbol of Mendelian randomization as a method of causal inference in genetic epidemiology. After 2003, researchers still hold a weight and their attitude towards Mendelian randomization. With the completion of the Human Genome Project, the maturity and update of genetic association studies such as GWAS, EVAS, and the researchers' reflection on the limitations of random controlled trials, Mendelian randomization has been receiving more and more attention. From the view of the number of papers annually published, research about Mendelian randomization is entering an outbreak period. It is foreseeable that the accumulation of literature in this field will continue to increase in the future. The geographic distribution of the network map about Mendelian randomization showed that the UK and the USA were dominant in this field, and China followed closely. Though there was still a gap, China was also the only developing country in the top 10 countries. And network cluster analysis showed sufficient cooperation between countries or institutions. The cooperation of a wide range of countries or institutions demonstrates the vitality and good perspectives of Mendelian randomization. The value and significance of related research is also the reason why we are willing to cooperate, which also helps to achieve a double win situation. And this table shows the top 10 authors in this field. Smith Jade from the University of Bristol, who published 22 articles with 202 articles with a total of 13,000 citations, occupying the first place. And this figure shows the network cooperation among 17 authors with a minimum number of documents of 20. A total of 7 cooperation author groups were dedicated, and top 10 authors were from 4 clusters, of which 5 from the University of Bristol belong to the Green cluster. And journal analysis found that there were 41 journals published 10 or more articles in this field. The International Journal of Epidemiology published the most articles in terms of the category of subject distribution. There were 3 journals of public, environmental, and occupational health, 3 journals of multidisciplinary science, 2 journals of endocrinology and metabolism, 1 journal of medicine, general and internal, and 1 journal of genetic heredity. And our finding, both co-cited journals supported the application of Bradford's law, and it's a bibliometric concept which showed that most researchers obtained their citations from a few main journals in their respective field of experts. When the researchers deviated from their co-journals, their citation frequency and impact were weakened. Consequently, this tendency led to a large percentage of citations stemming from a few co-journals. And in the frequency analysis of keywords, the top 5 keywords were coronary artery disease, cardiovascular disease, BMI, obesity, and blood pressure. These keywords represented popular areas where Mendelian randomization was applied. In keyword network clustering analysis, the 5 clusters were both cardiovascular disease, diabetes mellitus, and BMI, methodological research, smoking, alcohol, psychosis, and cancer. Through cluster analysis, it's not difficult to find that the research in Mendelian randomization mostly focused on some diseases that seriously affect human health, while etiology is unclear. Mendelian randomization is widely used in causal inference of cardiovascular disease such as coronary heart disease, atrial fibrillation, and valve disease. Research on blood pressure and metabolic disease have also received more and more attention. Cluster analysis also finds the enthusiasm of research to use Mendelian randomization in BMI and obesity-related research. More interesting, whether some acquired behaviors such as smoking, alcohol, sleep, and so on, and determined by genes, or whether they themselves are exposed as exposure to other diseases have also been widely studied. Psychiatric disease often has uncertain pathogenic factors that may increase research bias, and perhaps Mendelian randomization is the best way to verify the relevant risk factors to reduce it.
Jian-Guo, 1 minute, please wrap up.
Okay. And Mendelian randomization provides genetic evidence to explore the causal relationship between different experts and disease, which will be the cornerstone of today's RCT. To verify whether there is a definite causal inference between the risk factor and outcome in these trials, and this is the premise and the prerequisite for all RCTs. For the RCTs that have been carried out, Mendelian randomization should be used for supplementary verification at the genetic level. Although Mendelian randomization do have some limitations, including pleiotrophy, linkage disequilibrium, and imprecise estimate of causal effects, it does break and surpass the limitation of traditional RTCs. And the Mendelian randomization will enable us to better understand the relationship between health, disease, and genes, and make the research closer to the essence of science. And my presentation is over. And thank you, Ramona.
Thank you very much, and thank you for staying within the time. Obviously, a huge undertaking from a methodological standpoint, and that was very interesting example and well explained. I don't see any specific questions for you at this point, Jian-Guo, in the chat or the Q&A. So before we lose Hugh again, I will turn to him so he can make his presentation. Yay, unmuted.
Okay, sorry, I'm so sorry. Okay.
No
Yes.
problem. And I introduced you before, so go ahead.
Yes, you did. Thank you. Thanks very much. So let me just share my screen and see if I can figure out how to do that without crashing the system. Okay, am I screen sharing?
Perfect.
Yeah, great. Okay, so thanks a lot. It is a shame that I lost the spot. It was very nice to hear the previous presentation, but what I'm going to talk about takes us back to external replication. So is in some ways a different way of doing what Cyrus presented to us. So the presentation title is "How much bias is there in impact evaluations on development topics?" And this presentation draws on just under or just over 10 years of support, which has been provided by the Campbell International Development Group to authors conducting systematic reviews on development topics. So for a bit of background, we established the IDCG, which is the International Development Coordinating Group, in 2012. And it was the first new coordinating group that Campbell had formed since its establishment 10 years previously. And as part of that, we've supported around 40 author teams, many of whom have reached the publication of a Campbell systematic review, which is no mean feat, a major achievement. And we're very proud of all of our reviews. And we also developed, in order to enable these reviews, as systematic reviewing is still a relatively new field, and 10 years ago was, I think, pretty much unheard of in international development and development economics, development studies. So we also developed some approaches to enable authors to do the reviews, and that included approaches to assessing risk of bias. And so what I'm going to present draws on is a systematic review of the reviews that have used our approach to assessing risk of bias. Okay, so that's the goal. The specific purpose was slightly more nuanced, which was to see whether bias that was predicted by those critical appraisals, those risk of bias assessments, whether that bias was associated systematically with bias measured empirically. So in other words, we go to the effort of, when we do a high quality systematic review, of critically appraising every single study that's included in that review using a risk of bias tool. That's quite a highly technical process. It requires, for some authors, it requires some capacitation. So the question is, if we do all of that, is it worth it? Does it actually make a difference? Are studies that are assessed probabilistically of being of high risk of bias, do they generate biased estimates when we pull them in meta-analysis? And as I'm following Cyrus here, so that there are actually two ways of assessing empirically bias. One way is the internal replication studies, which I'm not going to talk about. The other way, which is this what I'm going to talk about, is the external replication approach. And so essentially what we're doing is very similar to the Metaketa approach, but we're drawing on a broader range of literature. So we're comparing studies across contexts that use the same interventions and the same outcomes, but which have different designs. And we're particularly interested in this work in comparing the results from non-randomized studies, sometimes called quasi-experiments, with the results from RCTs. And we're going to be drawing on 17 systematic reviews, two of which, no, three, I tell a lie, three of which were conducted by Cyrus, our co-panelist. And all of those reviews having used the risk of bias tool that we originally developed in order to enable our authors to help our authors do these reviews. Okay, so what does the risk of bias tool which itself drew on existing approaches. It based bias around 5 main categories, or what we call bias domains. And for each of those categories, there are questions which enable the reviewer to determine the likelihood of bias for that category. It's important to note that I think it's one of the only tools which assesses bias consistently for both randomized and non-randomized studies across these different categories. So we specifically developed it in order to enable some comparison of bias across randomized and non-randomized studies, but also within the non-randomized or quasi-experimental studies, the different types of designs that we often come across in development economics, whether those are different studies, difference in differences types of studies, instrumental variables, so Mendelian randomization being an example from the previous presentation of instrumental variables studies, studies using approaches like regression discontinuity, and also studies that use covariate control, so adjustment using selection on observables, so studies using approaches like adjusted regression and statistical matching. And so we have our essentially what we expect is that the randomized and non-randomized studies, although we can assess them consistently using these different approaches, we also expect that randomized and non-randomized studies to perform differently on these different sources on these different categories of bias. So, for example, we expect confounding will be more problematic for non-randomized studies, and in particular, non-randomized studies with selection on observables. We expect selection bias to be particularly problematic in retrospectively designed studies, but also in cluster RCTs where there isn't clear reporting of participant flow throughout the study. We would expect departures from intended interventions which cause performance because of performance and motivation bias. We'd expect some forms of that to be especially problematic in longitudinal studies, so whether those are RCTs or non-randomized studies. We expect and so on. So what the risk of bias tool does is it enables us for every single one of these categories to come up with a anticipated or a probable risk of bias, and those categories are low risk, some concerns, and high risk. And then overall, there's an assessment which is made. And most of the studies, there are different approaches to pulling together that overall risk of bias, but it's commonly done using a mini-max rule, I suppose we might call it, which is essentially if any one of the categories is, we take as the overall risk of bias assessment the highest risk of bias according to any one of these categories. So if a study was high risk of bias on confounding and selection bias, for example, but of some concerns or low risk on any of the other categories, the overall risk of bias according to this decision rule would be high risk. And this is an example of, if you've seen systematic reviews, you'll have seen this kind of bar charts which show the risk of bias assessment. This is at the systematic review level, and for those, and we also find that reviews that incorporate both randomized and non-randomized studies will usually report those assessments separately, and they'll also do the meta-analysis separately, even if they end up pooling the findings for RCTs and non-randomized studies at the end of the day. It's an important requirement of reviews that the analysis is done separately. So could we predict the direction of bias? And I suppose when I was starting to think about this study, I started to think, okay, well, we would usually expect we might expect that the results from non-randomized studies to exceed the results from RCTs, and that's for two main reasons. The first one is the issue of non-adherence in trials. So it's essentially we can think of a non-randomized study as very frequently, although it's not explicitly said, it often starts from it often measures the effect of an exposure rather than an intervention. And the difference, so in other words, for a randomized trial measuring the effect of an intervention, the causal pathway is longer. And so by definition, because of the expectation that we have of attrition in trials, we would just by definition expect the effect sizes to be smaller in trials than in other types of studies. And then second of all, there's the issue of publication bias. So we would publication bias, which is where authors and journal editors are more likely to publish a paper that shows an effect or shows something interesting. And it's less likely that this bias in publication is less likely to arise for randomized trials, simply because of the fact that they're bigger, they're more expensive, they may be better known because of the increasing standards towards publication of study protocols. So it's harder to bury those studies in the file drawer, even if they don't find an effect. But then theoretically, it also depends on the context. So there are various reasons for each of the different categories of bias why we might expect the direction of bias to be either positive or negative. And I show in this slide the examples of about omitted variable bias or factors relating to participant motivation and factors relating to reporting and site selection bias in trials. So this is gone too far. This is a overview of the 17 Campbell systematic reviews that are included in the analysis, which themselves provided data from 200 pooled effects, and we extracted all of the pooled effects for meta-analysis. Not all of the studies ended up being included although they're in the systematic review, they don't all get included in the meta-analysis. Am I running out of time?
Yes, 1 minute, please.
Oh dear. Okay, so okay. And what we do in this analysis is we calculate bias as this measure D by subtracting from the benchmark estimate, which is the RCT or the well-conducted RCT, the estimate that we are trying to assess that we suspect might be biased. And so all of these forest plots I'm going to show you show an estimate of bias, which is this estimate D, and they also all have a underlying standard error. So here's a forest plot showing the overall estimate of bias in non-randomized studies as compared to the RCT benchmark. So every single one of these points and shows the comparison of a pooled effect from across non-randomized studies in a systematic review as compared to the pooled effect of RCTs from the RCTs that answer the same question. So in other words, if we look at the bottom figure, when we look at this this diamond, what this is telling us is that overall there is a small but statistically significant difference in the estimates from when we look across all of the non-randomized studies in Campbell systematic reviews. So in other words, that when we conduct this analysis, even though only 4 of the individual estimates of bias are statistically significant, so that's 4 out of 27, when we take advantage of the greater power of meta-analysis, we can estimate a statistically significant finding, even for one which has a very small effect. But of course, there's a lot of heterogeneity. And as I mentioned, when we do risk of bias assessments, we categorize studies according to the likelihood of bias, whether that's low risk, some concerns, or high risk of bias. And so this is a forest plot that shows those findings. And essentially what that suggests is that non-randomized studies with low risk of bias and some concerns are producing the same pooled effects in meta-analysis as RCTs. But there's high risk non-randomized studies consistently overestimate effects. This is just another figure that compares, rather than comparing the non-randomized studies with all RCTs, it compares them with low risk of bias RCTs. So with essentially the same findings. And my final slide, almost final slide, says, okay, well, what if we compare RCTs themselves? What if we compare RCTs with some concerns and high risk of bias with RCTs with low risk of bias? And this is what we find, that actually, in contrast to all of the other findings, we're actually getting smaller magnitude of effects from studies with high risk of bias than from RCTs with high risk of bias. And one possible explanation for that is that RCTs that estimate bigger effects are just better designed and implemented, and that includes there may be this may provide evidence for site selection bias. So I think that I'm going to finish here. We've tried to conduct a systematic review of external replications, and we're using meta-analysis in order to look at it. And overall, doing risk of bias assessment is really important. Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, I forgot the most important thing when introducing you, which is your current affiliation with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, but that was apparent from your slides. So thank you for that very, very interesting presentation. So we've gone from governance to health with very in-depth discussions of various methodological approaches. And we now go from this presentation on biases, which I found very interesting, and I do want to come back to in the chat, in the discussion, to the final presentation of the day, which is by Joseph Mouanda, who is a statistician economist by training, and he has worked with the Independent Development Evaluation Group, Department of the African Development Bank for almost 19 years. He is currently Chief Evaluation Officer there. Joseph, you have the floor, and please try and stay to within the 10-12 minutes, so we do have a few minutes at least at the end for discussion. Thank you, and you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Ramona. I will start by setting the scene for our impact evaluation story. Just to mention that Ghana, officially the Republic of Ghana, is a country in West Africa. It spans the Gulf of Guinea and the Atlantic Ocean to the south. And like you can see in the second map, it's sharing border with Ivory Coast in west, Burkina Faso in north, and Togo in the east. And the project we did evaluators is located in the north region of the country, which was one of the poorest and most isolated region of the country. The Ghana Fufulso-Sawla Road include a section of road between Fufulso and Sawla, but also a serial of ancillary work, including school facility, health center, etc. And as you can see, the graphic shows how the ancillary work were made along the road. As for each evaluation, we prepared or we reconstruct the project logic, but just to say that the project, which was approved in 2010 and completed in 2015, aimed at enhancing accessibility along the Fufulso-Sawla Road and improving livelihood in the project area. So we can find the evaluation in our website. So we conduct the impact evaluation in 2019, so 4 years after the project completion, in the collaboration with Catholic University of American, and the team from the Catholic University of American was led by Dr. Maria Sofia Aguirre, well known in the term of integral economic development. Why did we select this project? We can say that the project was selected because of its transformative nature. Because here it's had intervention beyond transport sector to the main road. And the evaluation objective was to generate lessons and provide recommendations to maximize the impact of ongoing and future inclusive and integrated solution for infrastructure project. In terms of approach, we use what we call the integral economic approach by including in the survey design the interpersonal relational dimension of human action. This approach to impact evaluation measures more than just the immediate effect, that is, in this case, more than just economic, health, education outcome, and regional development generated in the target village. It also requires measuring change in the behavior of a beneficiary. Also, the intervention was not randomized, thus the evaluation design has been framed as a quasi-experiment. Accordingly, the evaluation compared the situation of a project or the beneficiary who participate in the project can call treatment group with those who did not participate. The most important here is to identify the best comparison road to this Fufulso-Sawla Road. So to that end, we identify, as it can be seen, a similar road that was not affected by the project, but with the same characteristic. And the community included in the control and treatment groups were selected randomly from the treatment and control district group within 4 identified strata: urban area, town, village along the road, and village removed from the road. To conduct the analysis, the evaluation utilized ordinary least square, the analysis of covariance and cover, the regression discontinuity, and interrupt times series analysis estimation in the context, as I said, of an integrated economic development approach. We also use a multi-data source and perspective, including survey to household, survey to teacher, health, and tourist professional, and also secondary data from household level national survey and tourism data from Ghanaian authority. And we use also the scoping mission to do a qualitative inquiry. And at the end, the evaluation quantify both quantitative and qualitative data. In terms of result, we can say that improvements were found in transportation-related outcome in the project beneficiary district in terms of access to socioeconomic service and multidimensional poverty and household income. And in terms of In terms of distribution, one of the most important findings was that the impact evaluation found that the ancillary work generated a proportionally greater additional effect than the additional cost. And this is very, very important for the policymaker. Also, the intervention specifically benefited women and girls, albeit to a lesser degree than the men. The project generated some positive and negative in intending impacts, such as a greater social cohesion, a catalytic investment effect, a charcoal burning activity, and rosewood logging. But what we found that the impact evaluation pointed to the maintenance issue on the road project and the ancillary work facility. And 7 reasons contributed to this, including poor scheme design, weak organization and institutional capacity, the lack of active community engagement, and lack of government and community ownership. To conclude, as a takeaway in terms of approach to measuring development impact, I can say that the nature of evaluant, here we are combining a serial of projects, make it to some extent the evaluation become complex. Thus, this has implication on the methodology and approach to be used in order to disentangle the project net effect and to address the human development aspect of a project. The value addition of using the integral economic development approach in the context of integrated solution for infrastructure project is that it's help reveal other relational factors which may not be shown with conventional impact evaluation approach. And finally, leveraging scoping mission to explore more qualitative finding as part of an early stage evaluation strategy is critical. The evaluation quantify both quantitative and qualitative data. Thus, the methodology proposed typically does not resort to focus group to collect qualitative data. Rather, it utilizes them as part of exploratory phase of a study. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joseph. And again, thank you for doing this so quickly. So we've had a presentation on the Metaketa approach, on the Mendelian randomization, analysis of the risk of bias across randomized and non-randomized studies, and then an impact evaluation of a specific project on the ground in Ghana. So very, very different approaches to measuring development impact, which is obviously something that is concerning all of us. I'd like now to turn to the panelists in perhaps the same order that they were supposed to go in. So Cyrus, Hugh, then Jian-Guo, and then Joseph. Cyrus, do you want to go back to the first 2 questions that I had asked, and any reflections and reactions you have to the other presentations from the other panelists as well?
Yeah, sure. Thanks again. I mean, you had asked about how these types of coordinated trials can help to push the conversation on the theory of change. And I mean, I think that, like, as a general point, I think, you know, the Medicare Initiative generates a series of sort of instantaneous replications. What we're trying to do now is trying to, like, rather than necessarily doing that, because it's a very difficult thing to pull off, is to try to create infrastructure that would allow people who are interested in contributing to a research program to sort of do that more organically. So there's this notion of a platform trial that you basically like have sort of standardized protocols and things like that that would allow people to generate evidence that could then accumulate in a similar way. And then the idea, is to reflect on the implications for a theory of change. And I think generally speaking, I think that like meta-analysis as a tool in and of itself, as sort of a barefoot statistical tool, would do well to, those who are doing meta-analyses would do well to like really take theory considerations into mind and think about how the results that they're developing, inform, basically like models of the types of processes that they're trying to characterize. And I'm somebody who uses actually like, sort of formal theoretical models. I think that's a very useful and clarifying exercise. So I know that Campbell and Cochrane have done a lot to promote, the articulation of a theory of change in a systematic review. I think that is a crucial step. I would say, insofar as it's part of the discipline that you're working in, to take that even further and sort of reflect on formal, sort of structural characterizations of the behaviors and the phenomena that you're trying to characterize. And, I think what would be great would be to see more work in that direction, deriving sort of formal theoretical models that help to synthesize results across studies. And so I think that having accumulation of studies like this helps in being able to think through, what reasonable models that characterize both heterogeneity, but then also systematic components could do. So it's a pitch I'd like to make for people to, invest more in formal theory. And then as far as policymakers being receptive, it's interesting, policymakers, want to have evidence, but then they understand that the circumstances in their own country or setting and the evidence produced there only speaks to things that they've witnessed directly, but that they have potentially something to learn from other places. Now you have to be careful with the comparisons that you're making. Sometimes people feel like another context is far too alien to like inform what's going on in their own context. But if you have a collection of studies, some of which include places that provide a very compelling comparison and example of sort of like alternatives or alternative circumstances, particularly like macro or structural circumstances that, provide an interesting contrast to what's going on, in a given location. I've found that those sorts of comparisons and contrasts really help policymakers to kind of internalize what the implications of the findings are and what a path forward might be. So I would encourage, again, like this sort of cross-context work and consideration of structural and contextual factors in those terms, because I do think it enriches one's interpretation of what's going on in a given location. I think those are some of the benefits here. I had posted some questions for Hugh. I think there was sort of a conversation going on there, and then I'll reflect a bit on Joseph and Jian-Guo's presentations and comment in the text chat area.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And you got us 3 cheers for theory as well in the chat, so you're not alone out there. And another question which you may want to also pick up. So Hugh, as I said, I will turn over to you. You did get some very specific questions on the methodology and also on your findings. And I did want to add one of my own. Again, not an expert in this area at all, but I did walk away with sort of this big finding that you had, that there is a much higher risk of bias overall, the overall risk in non-randomized studies compared to the randomized ones. So is there a recommendation on the basis of this? Are you recommending that people really do randomized studies at least whenever possible, or that's not the direction you're going in? So again, take it from a lay audience person.
Okay, yeah. So thanks a lot. I think, as with most analyses, it can be interpreted in different ways for people So you could interpret these findings to suggest that we should only do RCTs because RCTs, you know, are the least biased approach. You probably would have noticed that what we're explicitly doing in this analysis is making RCTs the benchmark. So we're coming from the perspective that for theoretical reasons that we would expect the RCTs to produce the unbiased estimate, and so it's kind of built into our findings. But what you'll have also noticed when you look at the findings, you'll see that the findings from and this is a really important reason, and I think why this research is worthy is because it shows why risk of bias assessment is important. So, you know, when you do a systematic review, you have to appraise the risk of bias. It's quite a technical, long exercise. It would be much easier if we could just, you know, assess studies based on the design and not have to assess how well they're implemented. But we do that because the implementation is really important. Even for, as somebody said in the question, oh, does this suggest that even RCTs can be biased? Yes, even RCTs can be biased, and that's why we do risk of bias assessment for any systematic review, even a systematic review which is restricted to RCTs. But what I think our meta-analysis suggests is that the degree of bias, the degree of empirical bias, depends on how well the study's been implemented and designed. So, for example, for the non-randomized studies with a very high risk of bias, well, we consistently see much bigger magnitudes of effect. So those studies and our interpretation of that is that those studies are highly biased. However, when we look at the studies with a lesser risk of bias, so that's the non-randomized studies that have been better designed and better implemented, and usually that is because they use methods with selection on unobservables like regression discontinuity designs, or like even double difference designs. Those studies seem to, when we look across them in a meta-analysis of absolute distance metrics, produce the same effects as the RCTs. And so I suppose, I think more generally, I'd like to pick up on Cyrus's point about theory, and then Annette's chat point about 3 cheers for theory. Yes, I completely agree. And everything that I presented is completely atheoretical and purposefully so. It's very abstract because at the level of aggregation that we're taking the analysis. But absolutely, we see in systematic reviews that there is some incorporation of theory, and authors will, you know, develop a theory of change, and then they'll report at findings along the causal pathway, right? Which isn't what I think you're talking about. I think what you're talking about is actually the formal incorporation of theory in order to determine mechanisms, basically, and that's the kind of so that's the kind of stuff which is starting to be done in development systematic reviews. So we produced a review last year, I think, where we tried to look at the mechanisms in governance programs, but there's a lot more scope for doing that work, and as the more and more studies we have, the more scope there is for articulating mechanisms. So completely agree.
Thank you, Hugh. And I think, I mean, we are obviously out of time, but given that it's the last slot of sessions in today's program, I will take additional time, and people seem to be staying with us and enjoying the discussion. So Jian-Guo, over to you. Do you have any reflections on perhaps the methodological discussion that is going on in terms of approaches to measuring development impact? And one thing that did strike me in particular was that, of course, most of the studies that you had found and used were from the US, UK, and China, also a few countries in Europe. When are we going to sort of move towards a larger database of studies that can be used, do you think?
That's I want to supplement something about Mendelian randomization, and just like you said that we need to access the risk bias of RCTs, and there is another solution is to do the Mendelian randomization. And as population-based genetic data sets become larger and new methods that allow weaker forms of current hypothesis become available, and Mendelian randomization can become an integral part of genetic epidemiology research. And Mendelian randomization provides genetic evidence to explore the causal relationship between different exposures and disease, which will be the cornerstone for today's RCTs, and it can to verify whether there is a definite causal influence between the risk factor and outcome in these trials, whatever it's RCTs or non-RCTs. And maybe this is a cohort studied. And this is the premise and prerequisite for all RCTs and un-RCTs. And for the RCTs that have been carried out, and we can also to do the Mendelian randomization to supplementary verification at the genetic level. And that was what I want to supplement it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. And turning over to Joseph, I have a question on the feedback loop as such. How are results of impact evaluations, such as the one that you presented, being used by the AfDB in your case for operations, for future lending and programs and so forth, but also by the recipient countries? I mean, in this case, it was Ghana, but it's a more general question. You are on mute, by the way, so you'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you for the question. The good news in African Development Bank is that for each evaluation, we present the evaluation to the board, and the board requests also to management to provide a management response. So our recommendation for each of our recommendations, the management should say what kind of action they will be taking in order to address the evaluation's finding. So we have a formal channel for which we can address all evaluation finding within the institution. And in the management response, they clearly say now, yes, we want to have now to develop, for instance, a guideline for the operation people to help them to address better this integrated solution for infrastructure. And as you can imagine, it's sometimes difficult, not only for the bank, operation guy on the bank, but also for the country to ask them when they are getting money for a road project, to ask them to include in a road project some other aspect. So having this kind of finding showing that you are having much more impact in having this kind of integrated solution rather than doing an isolation project, it's kind of, it's like you are providing them evidence on, it's not our role to ask them to do it, but we are providing to the policymaker evidence to try to change the way we are doing business, because infrastructure is for what? Infrastructure is to improve, the final aim is to improve the livelihood of a beneficiary. And using integrated solution is one of the way we have to do it. So definitely for the bank, we are happy to have a formal process that can help to use the finding of each evaluation, including this one. And now we are doing a series of webinars to present the finding and try to, I think now in Ghana, because of the success of the project, they are trying now to include in our policy the use of integrated solution. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. We've gone about 15 minutes over our time for the session, so I would like to close here, unless any of the panelists have any final thoughts or burning point that they want to add to the debate. Hugh might, but he's on mute again. Okay. No, all right.
Yeah, not
Just wanna say
really. No.
thank you.
All right, so thank you all very much. Very interesting and insightful discussion. Thank you to the audience as well for staying with us and for the questions. And I hope to see some of you around tomorrow as well for the final day of our conference. Thank you so much, and all the best with your studies in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Have a nice
Thank
evening
you.
or the rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.